The morning Richard Hale decided to make an example of someone. He chose the one person in the building who had just saved his company from losing $1 billion. He walked into the 31st floor of Hale and Marrow's corporate offices at 7:50 in the morning, flanked by two senior partners, intending to project the image of a leader restoring discipline to a firm he believed had grown soft. What he found in the glass-walled office at the end of the litigation corridor was a woman asleep at her desk. Her head rested against her folded arms, surrounded by towers of deposition binders, 3 empty coffee cups, and a laptop whose screen still glowed with a half-finished document. He did not ask a single question. He did not look at the screen. He did not give her the chance to speak. In front of two partners and half a dozen associates arriving for the day, he ordered her badge collected and her employment terminated effective immediately. Maya Ellison had barely lifted her head from the desk when he cut her off mid-sentence. Only hours later, as the Whitfield acquisition began unraveling in real time and the firm's largest client prepared to walk out the door, would Richard Hale understand that the woman he had just humiliated was the only reason that client still existed? Hale and Marrow was not a firm where a bad week was an inconvenience. It was one of the most aggressive corporate law practices on the East Coast, built over 3 decades on a single reputation. They did not lose clients, and they did not miss details. Their anchor client, Whitfield Industries, was a logistics and manufacturing conglomerate whose legal work generated nearly 40% of the firm's annual revenue. The relationship was currently balanced on the edge of a knife. Whitfield was in the final stages of a $1 billion acquisition of a competitor, a deal so large and so scrutinized that a single overlooked clause, a single procedural failure, could collapse it entirely and take the client relationship down with it. The deal was the firm. Everything else that year was decoration built around it. Maya Ellison carried the title of senior associate, though the title communicated almost nothing about what she actually did. She was 36 years old, the daughter of a postal worker and a night shift nurse from Baltimore, and she had arrived at Hale and Marrow the hard way: state school, night classes, a clerkship she had fought for against candidates with names that opened doors hers did not. She was quiet in the way of people who had learned early that being loud was a luxury. Not everyone was extended equally, and she had long ago stopped expecting the room to notice her. New associates who encountered her assumed she was competent but unremarkable, always slightly tired, always the last light on in the corridor, a cold cup of coffee perpetually forgotten beside her keyboard. She did not know how to perform visibility, and she had decided years ago to stop trying. The people who had actually worked beside her held a different understanding entirely. Maya knew the Whitfield account the way a cartographer knows a coastline she has walked by hand. She had been on the account for 7 years, longer than any partner currently attached to it. She knew the client's corporate history, its buried subsidiaries, the regulatory settlements from a decade ago that no one else had bothered to read, and the personalities of the opposing counsel down to which of them bluffed and which of them didn't. Partners presented the work. Maya was the reason the work was correct. She was the institutional memory the firm had never bothered to formally recognize, a load-bearing wall that everyone leaned on and no one looked at. Outside the office, Maya's life was organized around one fixed point. Her mother, Denise, who had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier and now lived with her, cared for in the mornings by a home aide Maya could barely afford and in the evenings by Maya herself. She did not mention this at work. She did not use her life as a credentialing device, did not explain the shadows under her eyes, did not ask for accommodation. She showed up. She worked. She went home to lift her mother from a wheelchair into bed. That was the shape of her life, and she had made a kind of peace with it, right up until the weekend that would test every hour of those 7 years. Richard Hale had not built the firm, his father had, but he had spent 20 years convincing himself he had earned the right to run it as though he had. He was 58, silver-haired, immaculate in a way that suggested effort disguised as effortlessness, and he had recently returned to day-to-day control after 3 years of semi-retirement, pulled back by whispers from the board that the firm had grown complacent under the managing partner he'd left in charge. The whispers stung him in a place he did not like to examine because they implied the thing he feared most, that the Hale name was coasting on its past. So he returned with an agenda he described in partner meetings as a cultural correction. Standards would tighten. Accountability would be visible. The era of comfort was over. He said these words often enough that they had stopped being a plan and had become a performance, and like all performances, it required an audience and, eventually, a scene. He was looking for one. He did not know it yet, but he was looking for one. Beneath the surface of that agenda, in the dense contractual underlayers of the Whitfield acquisition that Richard had not personally read in weeks, something had already begun to go wrong. 3 days before the morning that would define everything, Maya noticed something buried in the disclosure schedules delivered by the target company's counsel. It was small at first, a definitional inconsistency between the indemnification provisions in the main agreement and a side letter referenced in an exhibit, the kind of discrepancy that could be sloppy drafting or could be something else entirely. Most attorneys would have flagged it, requested a clarification, and moved on. But Maya had spent 7 years learning the rhythm of this deal's opposing counsel, and the discrepancy was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate immediately and impossible to ignore once recognized. It was too clean. Sloppy drafting leaves fingerprints, inconsistent formatting, orphan cross-references. This had none. It read like something placed rather than dropped. She traced it backward through 400 pages of schedules and discovered the architecture of a trap. The target company had quietly restructured a subsidiary 8 months earlier, moving a portfolio of environmental liabilities, remediation obligations from a chemical facility, litigation exposure that could plausibly run to several $100 million, into an entity whose disclosure had been fragmented across 3 separate exhibits, each individually innocuous, collectively devastating. The definitional inconsistency was the seam. If Whitfield closed the acquisition as drafted, it would inherit those liabilities with no recourse, no indemnification, and no legal remedy because the disclosures, read together by a court, would be deemed technically sufficient. The other side wasn't hiding the bomb. They were hiding the instructions for finding it, and they were counting on a firm racing toward a closing date to never assemble the pieces. The closing was scheduled for Monday morning. It was Thursday night. Maya escalated the way she was supposed to escalate. She took her preliminary analysis to Gordon Price, the partner supervising the deal, at 8 o'clock Friday morning. Gordon was 61, 18 months from a retirement package tied to the firm's revenue performance, and acutely aware that the Whitfield closing was scheduled to be announced the same week Richard Hale wanted to showcase the firm's renewed discipline to the board. He listened to Maya for 6 minutes, looked at her single-page summary, and told her politely, collegially, in the language of a man patting a junior colleague on the head, that opposing counsel were reputable people, that reopening diligence 3 days before closing would embarrass the firm and enrage the client, and that she should be very, very certain before creating alarm. "Keep looking," he said, in a tone that meant stop looking. "Don't raise this with the client. Don't put it in an email. Let's not create a paper trail of panic over what's probably a drafting error." Maya walked out of his office and did not comply in any meaningful sense. She could not go to the client directly. An associate contacting Whitfield's general counsel over a partner's head would end her career by lunch. She could not reopen formal diligence without authorization. What she could do was build the case so completely, so irrefutably, that no one could dismiss it. A full mapping of the restructuring, every fragmented disclosure assembled and cross-referenced, the precise revisions to the indemnification language that would diffuse the trap without alerting the other side that it had been found. It meant reconstructing 8 months of another company's corporate history from public filings and buried exhibits, alone, over a weekend, before Monday's closing. She called the home aide, arranged extra hours she could not afford, and started working. The 60 hours that followed were the kind of sustained endurance that most people never experience and fewer still ever have witnessed. Maya barely left her office. She worked through Friday night mapping the target company's subsidiary structure from state incorporation filings, comparing the entity chart opposing counsel had provided against the one the public record actually supported. They did not match. The mismatch was subtle: a holding company renamed, a jurisdiction changed from Delaware to a state with slower public disclosure requirements, but each discrepancy, once found, pointed toward the next like stones across a river. She ate from the vending machine on the 29th floor. She drank whatever coffee existed. Saturday morning she went home for 3 hours, bathed her mother, paid the aide in cash for the weekend, kissed Denise's forehead, and told her the thing she always told her, which was that everything was fine and she'd be home properly soon. Denise, whose speech had never fully returned after the stroke, gripped her daughter's hand with her good hand and held it a moment longer than usual, the way she did when she knew she was being lied to gently. By Saturday night, Maya had assembled the full picture, and the full picture was worse than her Thursday suspicion. The restructured subsidiary did not merely hold the environmental liabilities. Buried in a financing exhibit was a cross-default provision, a clause providing that if the liabilities were ever consolidated onto the acquirer's balance sheet, it would trigger technical default conditions across Whitfield's existing credit facilities. It was elegant, and it was vicious. The trap wasn't designed simply to saddle Whitfield with someone else's toxic obligations. It was designed so that the act of inheriting them would detonate Whitfield's own debt structure, forcing a renegotiation of nearly $2 billion in credit at the worst possible moment, with the target's largest shareholder, a private equity fund that Maya now realized held positions on both sides of the transaction, perfectly placed to profit from the wreckage. This was not sloppy drafting. This was not even ordinary sharp practice. Someone had engineered a controlled demolition and scheduled it for Monday at 10 in the morning. She documented everything. She built a memorandum the way a person builds an ark, not elegantly, but to survive what was coming. 41 pages, every claim footnoted to a source document, every fragmented disclosure reproduced and reassembled, the entity charts laid side by side, the cross-default language quoted in full with its implications traced through Whitfield's credit agreements clause by clause. She drafted the exact revisions to the indemnification and disclosure provisions that would neutralize the structure, surgical language changes that could be presented Monday morning as routine final draft cleanup, diffusing the bomb without ever announcing it had been found, preserving the deal, the client, and the firm's reputation all at once. It was, though no one would know it for another day, some of the finest legal work ever performed inside that building. Sunday night past 11, she sent Gordon Price a single email, carefully worded to survive his defensiveness. Completed the review you asked me to continue. Findings attached. This must reach the client before the 10 a.m. closing. Available all night at this number. She attached the memorandum. Then, because 7 years on this account had taught her exactly how firms like hers lost billion-dollar clients, she printed 2 hard copies. One she placed in a sealed envelope on Gordon's chair. The other she kept squarely in the center of her own desk, beneath a handwritten cover note in block letters. Do not allow WHITFILD closing to proceed before reading this. Liability structure hidden in SCHEDULES. Call me first. She wrote her cell number beneath it twice. The closing was in 11 hours. She intended to be in the conference room for it, positioned at the back the way senior associates were, close enough to hand the revisions to whoever would listen. She checked the filing index one final time, confirmed the memorandum had uploaded to the deal room where at least the metadata would timestamp her work, and decided to rest her eyes for a moment before drafting the talking points Gordon would need. It was 4:40 in the morning. She had slept perhaps 5 of the previous 60 hours. The body has limits that override intention when pushed past them. Her head came down onto her folded arms, the laptop still glowing beside her, the envelope centered on the desk not 8 inches from her face. At 7:50, Richard Hale stepped off the elevator looking for a scene. He had chosen the 31st floor deliberately. The litigation and transactions corridor was where the firm's real work happened, which made it the ideal stage for the demonstration he had been rehearsing in his head all weekend. The board's technical liaison was arriving at 9. The Whitfield closing was at 10. Richard wanted the story of the day to be a firm sharpened back into discipline under his hand, and stories, he knew, needed images. He walked the corridor slowly, 2 senior partners half a step behind him, nodding at associates who straightened visibly as he passed, and he was nearly at the end of the hall when he saw, through the glass wall of the corner office, exactly the image he had been looking for, except it was the wrong one, and he would not know that for another 5 hours. A woman was asleep at her desk. Head down on her forearms, suit jacket creased, surrounded by what looked to him like clutter, binders stacked in leaning towers, coffee cups, paper everywhere. The morning light came through the window behind her and lit the scene with an almost theatrical clarity. Richard stopped. The partners stopped. Down the corridor, a handful of early associates slowed, sensing atmosphere the way people in firms learn to. What Richard saw was not a person. It was a symbol, the perfect, gift-wrapped embodiment of everything he had been telling the board had gone wrong. Comfort. Slippage. A firm asleep, literally asleep, on the morning of its most important closing in a decade. He did not look at the laptop screen, where a document titled Whitfield Indemnification Revisions Final sat open at page 9. He did not see the envelope in the center of the desk, or did not register it, because envelopes do not photograph in the mind the way a sleeping employee does. He looked at the nameplate on the door. Then he pushed the door open hard enough that the glass shuddered in its frame. Ms. Ellison. Maya surfaced the way the profoundly sleep-deprived surface, in layers, disoriented, her ears ringing, her eyes dry and slow to focus. For 2 or 3 seconds she genuinely did not know where she was. Then the room assembled itself around her. The binders, the window, the silver-haired man in the doorway whom she recognized from the firm-wide announcement and the oil portrait in the lobby, and behind him an audience. She sat up. Her first fully conscious thought was not embarrassment. It was the time. Her eyes went to the corner of her laptop screen, 7:52, and relief moved through her because there was still time, and the man standing in her doorway was, by pure accident, exactly the level of authority she needed to reach. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice rough with sleep, "I need to speak with you about the Whitfield closing before. This firm does not pay people to sleep in it." His voice was pitched to carry, and it did, down the corridor into the open workspace, into the memory of everyone present. Least of all this morning, least of all on this floor. "Sir, there is a liability structure hidden in the disclosure schedules. The closing cannot. Do you know what today is?" He said it over her, not to her, half turned toward the partners as if inviting them to witness. "Today this firm closes the largest transaction in its history, and I find a senior associate unconscious at her desk like it's a dorm room." He turned to the partner on his left. "Have security collect her badge. HR processes the termination today." Maya stood. She was not a person who raised her voice, and she did not raise it now, which was perhaps her mistake, because in rooms like this one, calm is often read as guilt. "Mr. Hale, please. There is an envelope on this desk. If the closing proceeds on the current draft, Whitfield inherits several $100 million in concealed environmental liability and a cross-default that. I've heard everything I intend to hear." He had already turned away. It was done in his mind. The scene had landed, the story had its image, and everything she said now was noise from a person protecting herself. Security was already coming down the corridor. The associates watched in silence. Several of them knew she had been there all weekend. None of them spoke. Speaking would have been an act of extraordinary boldness, and it was 7:54 in the morning, and the man had been in control of the firm for 6 days. Maya looked at the envelope on her desk. Then she picked up a pen, wrote 4 words across its face in block letters, "Give THIS to WHITFILD," and handed it to the nearest associate, a second year named Marcus Webb, whose hands took it before his judgment could refuse it. She lifted her badge over her head, set it on the desk, and walked out past Richard Hale without another word, because she had said what mattered twice and been cut off twice, and there was nothing left to spend. After Maya left the building, the 31st floor continued functioning, the way institutions do in the hours before they understand what they have done. The morning resumed its rhythm. The story of the firing moved through the corridors faster than any official communication could have. Hale fired someone on the closing morning, asleep at her desk, made an example of her, and it landed exactly the way Richard had intended it to land. Associates arrived at their desks a little earlier than usual. Partners answered emails with a little more speed. In the ecosystem of fear he had been cultivating for 6 days, the morning was, by his measure, a success. He rode the elevator up to greet the board's technical liaison with the satisfied calm of a man whose narrative was assembling itself on schedule. Gordon Price arrived at 8:20, later than he had planned, having silenced his phone over the weekend on the theory that a man 18 months from retirement had earned his Sundays. He found the sealed envelope on his chair, recognized Maya's handwriting, and felt a small cold weight settle in his stomach. He had, by then, already heard about the firing. It had reached him in the elevator, and the two facts arranged themselves in his mind not as a warning, but as a problem of self-preservation. If the envelope contained what he suspected it contained, then he was the partner who had been told first and had said keep looking in a tone that meant stop looking. He sat down, opened his email, and found her Sunday night message with the 41-page memorandum attached. Time-stamped 11:14 p.m., he read the first page and a half. Then he made the calculation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The closing was in 90 minutes. The associate who wrote it had just been terminated for cause in front of a dozen witnesses, and reopening a billion-dollar transaction on the strength of a fired employee's memo would require him to explain to Richard Hale why he had known on Friday and said nothing. He slid the envelope into his desk drawer. Probably a drafting error, he told himself. Reputable counsel. He closed the email and went to prepare for the signing. Marcus Webb, second-year associate, spent 40 minutes with Maya's envelope on his desk, feeling it radiate. He was 27 years old, carried $160,000 in law school debt, and had just watched the chairman of the firm terminate a senior associate for the crime of being visibly exhausted. Give THIS to WHITFILD was an instruction from a person who no longer worked there, addressed to a client he had no standing to contact, on a morning when standing out meant standing next to the door. At 9:15 he tried a middle path. He carried it to Gordon Price's office and offered it at the threshold. Gordon looked at the envelope, recognized the handwriting a second time, and said, with the impatience of a man suppressing something, "She's been terminated, Marcus. It's handled." That settled it in the practical logic of institutional hierarchy. A dismissed employee's final words carry approximately the weight of a stranger's opinion. Marcus put the envelope in his bag rather than the trash, which was the one decision of that morning anyone would later be able to defend, and went back to his desk. At 10:00 a.m., in the 40th floor conference room, under glass and good light, the Whitfield acquisition closed on the current draft. Signature pages were exchanged. Wire instructions were confirmed. Richard Hale shook the hand of Whitfield's chief executive, while a photographer from the firm's marketing department captured the moment for the announcement. Opposing counsel, 3 of them, gracious and unhurried, smiled with what everyone in the room read as professional courtesy. Only one person in the world could have read those smiles correctly, and she was, at that moment, riding a bus across town, because her car was at the mechanic and her badge no longer opened the parking structure, holding her personal effects in a paper bag, going home to relieve an aide she could no longer afford to pay. In the first hour there was nothing. Deals do not explode like bombs, they explode like dominoes. At 12:40, a paralegal doing routine post-closing integration flagged an entity in the acquired company's structure that did not appear on the pre-closing chart. At 1:15, Whitfield's treasury team, updating consolidated balance sheets, triggered an automated covenant alert on the company's primary credit facility. At 1:50, Whitfield's general counsel, a precise, unsentimental woman named Patricia Acaffer, called Gordon Price and asked him a question he could not answer. And at 2:05, alone in his office with the door closed, Gordon finally opened the envelope in his drawer and read all 41 pages, and understood, with a horror that arrived in layers, that everything now happening had been mapped, predicted, and preventable by a woman the firm had marched out of the building 6 hours earlier. The unraveling, once it began, moved with the speed of something engineered because it was. At 2:30, the private equity fund holding positions on both sides of the transaction issued a notice through the acquired subsidiary's lenders, formally asserting the cross-default. It was polite, procedural, and devastating. Within the hour, Whitfield's banks froze a scheduled drawdown the company needed for Friday payroll across 4 distribution centers, pending what the notice delicately called a review of consolidated obligations. The environmental liabilities, now sitting on Whitfield's balance sheet in full view of its auditors, triggered disclosure obligations that would become public within days. Patricia Acaffer called Hale and Merrow a second time at 3:10, and this time she did not ask questions. She informed Gordon Price that Whitfield was convening an emergency board session, that outside counsel, the phrase landed like ice, because Hale and Merrow was outside counsel, and she was already speaking as though they weren't, would be evaluated for malpractice exposure, and that she expected the firm's complete diligence file delivered to her office by 6 o'clock. 40% of the firm's revenue had just announced, in the language lawyers use for such things, that it was deciding whether to sue its own law firm. Richard Hale learned of the crisis the way men like him always learn of crises, last, and in the worst possible room. He was in the middle of a self-congratulatory debrief with the board's technical liaison when his assistant interrupted, something she had been instructed never to do, and the look on her face moved him out of his chair before she finished her sentence. He arrived on the 31st floor for the second time that day and found it transformed. The transactions group was gathered around the main conference table like a trauma team, documents spread across every surface, 3 associates simultaneously on phones with the client's treasury department, and Gordon Price standing at the head of the table with the particular gray stillness of a man watching his retirement burn. Richard asked what was happening. The room went quiet in a way that told him everyone present knew something he did not. It was Gordon who finally said it, because there was no version of the afternoon in which he could avoid saying it, and some cornered instinct told him that saying it first was marginally better than having it said about him. The acquisition closed with concealed liabilities in the target structure, several $100 million in environmental exposure, and a cross-default provision that's detonating Whitfield's credit facilities right now. He paused. We had a complete analysis of it in-house before the closing, 41 pages. It identified everything that's happening in advance in order with the exact revisions that would have prevented it. Then, why in God's name didn't we use it? The silence that followed had a texture to it. Later, the people in that room would disagree about how long it lasted, but no one would forget the sensation of watching Richard Hale's face as the pieces began to assemble slowly at first, and then, in the space of about 2 seconds all at once. Who wrote it? He asked, though the vertigo already moving through him suggested that some part of him knew. Maya Ellison, Gordon said. She flagged it to me Friday morning. I told her to keep it quiet until she was certain. She spent the weekend building the full analysis. She emailed it to me at 11 Sunday night. He did not have the courage for the whole truth, so he offered its outline. She was still here when he stopped. He gestured vaguely at the morning. The memorandum was already on the conference table, printed and spiraling through the group in pieces. Richard picked it up and read it standing in the middle of the room while his firm bled around him. He was not a transactional expert, but he did not need to be. The document had been written by someone who assumed her reader would be hostile, skeptical, and rushed, and it was therefore merciless in its clarity. Entity charts side by side, every fragmented disclosure reassembled. The cross-default traced clause by clause into Whitfield's credit agreements with page citations. And on the final page, the surgical language revisions that would have diffused all of it before 10 o'clock that morning, followed by a single line slightly larger than the rest that had evidently been added last. If I am unreachable, do not allow the closing to proceed on the current draft under any circumstances. This is not a drafting error. It is a design structure. Call me first. Beneath it, a phone number, written twice. Nobody had called it. Richard set the memorandum down on the table with hands that were no longer entirely steady. Around him, the room had resumed its triage. Patricia Acaffer's 6 o'clock deadline was approaching, and the diligence file being assembled for her would contain, unavoidably, the 41-page proof that the firm had known. There was no version of the file without it. The deal room metadata had timestamped Maya's upload at 11:22 Sunday night, and metadata does not respond to pressure. The firm's exposure was no longer a question of whether Whitfield could prove negligence. It was a question of whether Whitfield's lawyers would be merciful, and Patricia Acaffer had built a career on not being. Can we fix it? Richard asked. Unwind it, reform the agreement, litigate the concealment, what's the path? A senior transactions partner answered him with the pale composure of a man who had decided to say the true thing. The path runs through fraud claims against the seller and the fund. It's viable, she proved the structure was designed, and that's the foundation of the whole case. But building it requires someone who understands how the concealment was engineered, every fragmented disclosure, every entity move, the whole architecture. The person who understands it, he lifted his copy of the memorandum slightly, is the person who found it. There are maybe 3 attorneys in this city who could reconstruct this from a standing start, and none of them work here, and Whitfield needs answers tonight. Then get her back, Richard said. Call her. We've called 4 times, Gordon said quietly. She isn't answering. Marcus Webb, standing at the edge of the room, chose that moment to spend the only currency a second-year associate has, which is the truth. He stepped forward and set a slightly creased envelope on the table in front of the chairman. Give THIS to WHITFIELD, it said in block letters. She handed me this on her way out, he said. This morning. I tried to give it to someone. He did not look at Gordon when he said it, which was its own form of mercy. Nobody would take it. Richard looked at the envelope for a long moment. A woman being marched out of a building in front of her colleagues, career detonated, reputation shredded before 9 in the morning, and her final act on the premises had been to try, a third time, to save the client. He thought about the sentence he had spoken over her. I've heard everything I intend to hear. He had been in control of the firm for 6 days, and he had chosen, as his first defining act, to silence the one person in the building who knew where the bomb was. He asked HR for her home address himself. The file was thin, no emergency leave requests, no accommodation filings, no complaints, 7 years of flawless reviews written by partners who had somehow never promoted her, and the address took several minutes to confirm. He called the number from the memorandum 3 times from the car. Each time it rang through to a voicemail box that was full. The building was in a modest neighborhood across the river, older brick, window units, a place where people lived rather than performed living. Richard Hale had not personally knocked on a door in a very long time. He stood in the hallway in his closing day suit, registering the distance between the 40th floor conference room and this corridor, and knocked. No answer. He knocked again harder and was reaching for his phone when the door opened on a chain and a woman in scrubs looked out at him with the flat, assessing wariness of a caregiver who has learned to read visitors quickly. I'm looking for Maya Ellison, he said. It's urgent. It's about her work. She doesn't work there anymore, the aide said. I heard. Whole building probably heard. But she studied him a moment longer, something in his face apparently overriding something else, and unlatched the chain. Inside, the apartment was small and immaculately ordered, the careful economy of a life organized around necessity. A wheelchair by the window, a hospital-grade bed visible through a bedroom door. In an armchair sat an older woman, silver-haired, her right hand curled inward against her chest, her eyes sharp and fully present, tracking him. And on the sofa, still in the suit from that morning, one shoe off and one shoe on, lay Maya, not asleep so much as switched off, a person who had not chosen to stop but had simply run out of anything left to give. Her phone sat on the coffee table, screen lit with missed calls, beside an unopened envelope from a home care billing service. The aide lowered her voice. She got home around 11, paid me for the weekend, checked her mother's medications, sat down, and that was it. She looked at Richard and her voice cooled by a degree. 60 hours she worked, you know that, for people who did that to her this morning. The older woman in the armchair made a sound, not quite a word, and her good hand moved, deliberate and unmistakable, gesturing Richard closer. Denise Ellison could not say much anymore, but she could still make a man stand where she wanted him to stand. Richard crossed the small living room and stood where the old woman's eyes directed him. And for a moment the chairman of one of the most powerful firms on the East Coast was held in place by a woman who could no longer speak in sentences. Denise looked at him, at the suit, at the closing day tie, at the face he had worn into her home, and then her gaze moved, slow and deliberate, to her daughter on the sofa and back to him. The message required no grammar. Look at what you did. Look at what she is. Richard looked. He saw the creased suit from the morning's humiliation, still on because changing out of it would have required something she no longer had. He saw the missed calls glowing on the phone she had slept through. He saw on the coffee table a legal pad covered in her handwriting, talking points he realized, drafted for the closing she had planned to attend, for the partner who had ignored her, organized and bulleted so that even a hostile listener could follow them in 90 seconds. She had prepared to be doubted. She had prepared for all of it, except for never being allowed to speak at all. Ms. Ellison, he said it quietly. Then less quietly because the situation did not allow him the mercy of waiting. Maya. She surfaced in layers, the way the profoundly depleted do, a flinch, a slow reassembly, eyes opening to a ceiling she knew and then to a face that did not belong beneath it. She sat up by degrees. She looked at Richard Hale standing in her living room, and her first expression was not anger and not fear. It was the specific exhaustion of a person being handed one more demand they did not ask for, arriving through their own front door. My badge is on the desk, she said, voice rough. If HR needs something signed, the closing went through, Richard said. On the current draft. Maya closed her eyes. It was not shock. It was the particular heaviness of being right about something you had spent 60 hours hopping not to be right about. The cross default, she said. Fired at 1:15. The banks froze the payroll drawdown. Whitfield's board is in emergency session and their general counsel has our diligence file including your memorandum. They know we knew. He paused and then said the rest because she would learn it anyway. They're evaluating claims against the firm. She reached for the phone, scanned the screen, 4 calls from the firm's main line, 2 from Gordon, 1 from a number she recognized as Patricia Acaffer's office, and set it back down. She looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was no triumph in it, which somehow made it worse for him. I tried to tell you at 7:52 this morning. You had everything you needed 8 inches from my face. I know. He did not reach for the careful language, the process gaps and communication breakdowns vocabulary that men in his position kept within arm's length. Standing in her living room in front of her mother, the vocabulary was unavailable. I fired you before you finished a sentence. I saw an image that confirmed a story I'd already decided to tell, and I never looked past it. I was wrong, and it may cost the firm its largest client and a 9-figure judgment. I'm not here to pretend the apology is the point. Whitfield needs the fraud case built against the seller and the fund tonight, and there is exactly one person who understands how the concealment was engineered. There are three, Maya said. Kessler at Dunmore. I ache if you can get her off her trial. Neither of them will be up to speed before Whitfield's banks force a restructuring. It was not a boast. It was an assessment, delivered the way she delivered everything, and it hung in the room as the simple fact it was. Denise made a sound from the armchair. Maya turned to her mother, and something passed between them that did not require words, a question asked, an answer given, permission neither offered nor needed but exchanged anyway. Maya checked her watch, then looked at the aide with the arithmetic of her life visible on her face for exactly 1 second before she put it away. I can stay till morning, the aide said quietly. We'll sort it after. Maya stood, steadying herself against the sofa arm. I'm going back for Whitfield, she said to Richard. 12,000 people work there. Their payroll is frozen because of a document I couldn't get anyone to read. That's the reason, not the apology, not the job. She looked at him evenly. We'll discuss terms when the client is safe. She changed in 4 minutes, kissed her mother's forehead, and picked up the legal pad on her way to the door. In the car, crossing back over the river in the last of the daylight, neither of them spoke. There was nothing useful to say yet, and they both knew it, and the silence was, in its way, the first honest thing they had built together. When Maya walked back onto the 31st floor at 7:40 that evening, 11 hours after being marched off it, the room changed in a way that was not quite describable but was immediately felt by everyone present. It was not celebration. It was closer to the specific relief of people who have spent an afternoon managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the relevant capacity come back through the door. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone stood up without knowing why. Gordon Price, at the head of the conference table, went very still, and whatever he had prepared to say did not survive contact with her face. She did not look at him with anger. She looked at him the way you look at a door that failed to open, and then she looked past him because there was work. She did not acknowledge the shift in the room. She moved to the head of the table, took the seat someone vacated without being asked, and requested 3 things: the complete post-closing file, a direct line to Patricia Acaffer's office, and the room's attention for 4 minutes. She got all 3. Then she started distributing the work. She put 4 associates on the public record reconstruction. Every filing, every entity change, every officer overlap between the target's restructured subsidiary and the private equity fund, assembled into a single timeline with exhibits. She sent 2 more to pull the fund's disclosures from its other portfolio transactions, because a structure this elegant, she said flatly, was not built for the first time on this deal, and pattern evidence was what turned a contract dispute into a fraud case. She asked a 3rd group to draft the emergency motion papers, the injunction against the lenders enforcing the cross-default, grounded in the concealment. She put Marcus Webb, specifically and by name, on privilege review, and if the choice was also a message, she did not explain it. And she asked one person to do nothing except record every step in order, because this case would be audited by hostile eyes and its integrity had to be self-evident. The distribution was its own kind of demonstration. She was not performing mastery. She was executing a plan she had been building mentally since Saturday night. The litigation architecture had been sitting in the back half of her weekend analysis all along, the part no one had read past page 20 to find, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than she had hoped. Watching her, Richard understood something that reorganized his entire model of the firm his father had built. The institution's actual value had never lived where the nameplate said it did. At 9:15, Patricia Acaffer arrived in person with 2 of her deputies, prepared to be managed and visibly braced against it. Maya did not manage her. She walked her through the architecture of the concealment for 40 minutes, the fragmented disclosures, the jurisdiction shopping, the cross-defaults engineering, the fund's position on both sides, and then, without pausing, through the counterattack. Fraudulent inducement against the seller, aiding and abetting claims against the fund, the injunction that would freeze enforcement of the cross-default before the bank's deadline, and the rescission demand that would put the entire transaction back on the table. Patricia stopped her twice with questions designed to find the bottom of her knowledge. She did not find it. At 9:55, Whitfield's general counsel closed her folder, looked across the table, and said the sentence that saved the firm. Whitfield will hold its malpractice claims in abeyance on the condition that she runs this. The injunction was filed at 6:00 for the next morning and granted by noon. The banks, presented with documented fraud, unfroze the payroll drawdown by end of day. 12,000 paychecks cleared on Friday as if nothing had happened, and almost none of the people cashing them would ever know how close it had come. Within 3 weeks, confronted with the pattern evidence from 4 prior transactions, the fund's position collapsed into settlement negotiations. The deal was reformed, liabilities carved back to their rightful owners, indemnification rewritten in language Maya had drafted at 2 a.m. on that first Sunday, when no one was listening. Whitfield stayed. The firm survived, and the 41-page memorandum that had spent a morning sealed in a desk drawer became Exhibit A in a fraud recovery worth over $300 million. Gordon Price announced his retirement effective immediately, before the firm could hold the review that would have ended in the same place with more witnesses. On his way out, he stopped at Maya's office. She had not moved back into it yet. The badge was still sitting where she'd left it and stood in the doorway for a moment, and whatever he had come to say, he did not manage it. "You were right," he finally said. It was not enough, and they both knew it, and it was also everything he had. The emergency review was held 10 days later, once the client was safe, and the injunction had hardened into settlement talks. Department heads, the executive committee, and the board's liaison gathered in the 40th floor conference room, the same room where the deal had closed under glass and good light, and the incident was presented in full, in order, without decoration. Maya had found the structure first, 3 days before anyone else. She had reported it through proper channels and been told, in effect, to stay quiet. She had worked 60 hours to build the proof no one could dismiss. She had been terminated before she could finish a single sentence. Her explicit written warning had sat sealed in a drawer while the firm closed the deal she had begged it not to close. And the collapse had unfolded exactly as she had predicted, in the order she had predicted, at the cost she had predicted. Several people in the room began reaching for the careful language institutions produce when they want to distribute responsibility broadly enough that no single failure becomes too visible. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, the unfortunate compression of a leadership transition. Richard recognized the vocabulary because he had spent 30 years fluent in it, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had recently stood in a small apartment being judged by a woman who could not speak, that reaching for it now would be a precise repetition of the failure that had produced the crisis. He stood. 10 days ago, I fired Maya Ellison before I had heard one complete sentence from her. I did it publicly to make an example, because the image of her asleep at her desk fit a story I had already decided to tell about this firm. The truth is that she was the only person in this building doing the job all of us claimed to do. My error nearly cost us our largest client, a 9-figure judgment, and the thing my father actually built, which was never the name on the door. I was wrong, and I am saying so to her, in front of all of you on the record. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something true and costly has been said plainly. Maya, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single small nod. She did not perform forgiveness for the audience. She received the apology the way you set down something heavy, not because it was resolved, but because continuing to carry it served no one. What she negotiated in the weeks that followed became, quietly, more consequential than the settlement itself. The firm offered partnership immediately. She took it, but only after the structural terms were signed first. A protected escalation channel guaranteeing any attorney a direct path to the executive committee on matters of client risk, a path that could not be blocked, slowed, or punished by a supervising partner protecting his own comfort. a formal policy shielding anyone who raised a genuine alarm from professional retaliation, with teeth. And a review of 7 years of advancement decisions on her floor, because she had not been the only careful, quiet, unglamorous lawyer the firm had been leaning on and looking past, and she named names, not of the guilty, but of the overlooked. When she presented the terms to the executive committee, the room was very still. Everyone present understood what they were looking at. A person handed enormous institutional leverage, spending nearly all of it on the next Maya Ellison, whoever and wherever she was. Richard changed in the way that matters, which is to say slowly, structurally, and without announcements. His decisiveness remained. His standards stayed high. But he began arriving on working floors not to inspect but to ask, and he learned, expensively, permanently, to recognize the difference between someone performing their work loudly and someone quietly holding something essential together. One evening some weeks later, he crossed the lobby and saw Maya near the entrance, crouched slightly, listening with complete attention as her mother, in the wheelchair out of the apartment, silver-haired and bright-eyed in the last of the afternoon light, delivered in gestures and half-words some emphatic commentary that made Maya laugh in a way no one at the firm had ever heard. Her face was entirely different than the one he had memorized under pressure. Open, unguarded, lit from within in a way professional competence does not produce. He stood back because he had learned to recognize the moments that belonged to other people. Then Denise saw him, and her good hand rose and deliberately, unmistakably, with something that might have been mercy and might have been mischief, waved him over. He went. That was the whole lesson in the end. When someone finally gives you the chance to listen, you go. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Maya's position and whether Richard earned his second chance. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories where quiet dedication finally gets the recognition it deserves. Until next time.